Tonight, for my opening remarks, I want to talk about a topic that I have done a lot of reading about lately. And I want to talk about it because it's something that the more I've investigated it, the more I've realized how highly relevant it is to what we are living under right now. And you wouldn't think it would be related, but it's heavily related to what we are doing and what we are living in and the struggles we are going through in our time. And that event is the English Civil War. It's interesting. I never learned anything about the English Civil War when I was in school. I learned about the French Revolution, learned about the American Revolution, I learned about the American Civil War, but I never learned about the English Civil War. Very few people in the United States, and even in England, know very much about the English Civil War. But I've been reading about the English Civil War and learning about it because it is highly relevant to understanding where we're at. It's very, very, very relevant in our time. And I'm going to talk tonight about the English Civil War. And I'm going to talk about it in a way that utilizes Marxist materialism, but also utilizes other ways of understanding history, because I want you to understand the English Civil War from the perspective of somebody who wants to understand how history moves forward, from the perspective of somebody who wants to make a better world, and not from the perspective of good guys and bad guys, because there's too much internet virtue signaling these days. You know, people just trying to show that they're good, that they're moral. And if you look at an event like the English Civil War, this is a very complex event that happened. It's a dynamic, pivotal event in the history of Western civilization. Very, very important. Very relevant in the history of the United States, as I'll get to later. Very relevant in the history of Britain, but in the history of the world. It's a very, very important event, the English Civil War. But if you look at it in terms of who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, you're going to be disappointed, because there's a lot of bad all around. There's a lot of bad all around in the English Civil War. But it was a moment where history marched forward and doors were opened and things happened. There were divisions among the rulers, and those divisions called forth movements among the people. It is very, very relevant to what we are doing and going through right now. And so let us talk about the English Civil War. In the 1600s in Britain, the state religion was the Church of England. Now, the Church of England was technically Protestant. It was not Catholic, but the Protestant Reformation had come to Britain differently than it came to the rest of Europe. We all know the Protestant Reformation in Switzerland and in Germany. You had Martin Luther nailing his thesis to the church wall. You had Ulrich Zwingli. You had, open defiance of the Catholic Church, people translating the Bible into their own languages. That's how the Protestant Reformation happened on the European mainland. But in Britain had broken with the Catholic Church in a very different way. King Henry VIII, he had wanted to get divorced, and the Pope wouldn't let him. So he cut ties with Rome, with the Vatican. You're on the list. He cut ties with Rome, and he established the Church of England. And the Church of England was not that different than the Catholic Church. It had priests. It had a lot of elaborate rituals. Priests were allowed to get married. And there were some other changes in the Church of England. But the Church of England was more or less the Catholic Church watered down. It wasn't the Lutheran Church. It wasn't Anabaptist reformers. It was just a version of the Catholic Church that would allow King Henry VIII to get married. It was the Church of England. And it was the state religion. And it's still the state religion in Britain, mind you, right? I mean, you'll notice in Britain, wings of the government are referred to as ministries, right? They have the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Education. Well, that's because the government in Britain is technically combined with the Church of England. And it was the state religion. And back in the 1600s, it was a crime not to attend church. If you didn't attend church, you could be fined. You could be publicly whipped. It was a crime. They kept attendance at church, and if you were not there, you violated the law. And at that time, the Church of England upheld that the king was allowed by God to rule, that he had divine right, that the King of England had been appointed by God to rule over the world, the country, right? Just as the church had been appointed by God to rule over humanity, the king had been appointed by God to rule over the nation. And it was taught by the Church of England that to oppose the king was a great sin against God. And the church was a mechanism through which the aristocracy, those are the landlords, the nobles, and the king, it was a method through which they ruled over the country. Everyone was required to go every Sunday. They learned that the king had divine right and ruled over them. It was the state religion, the Church of England. However, feudalism, the economic system where you have serfs on the land and you have landlords, that system was in decline. And in London, the capital city, and in many of the urban centers, there was a vibrant capitalist economy that was developing in Britain at the time. You had factories where people worked and created products that were sold. You had stores, and you had a vibrant capitalist economy. You had a working class of people who sold their labor power, rented themselves out, and got a wage. They weren't serfs on the land. They were wage workers. You had people who lended money. You had factory owners, and you had a capitalist economy developing in the urban centers. But in the countryside, you more or less still had the remnants of feudalism. You had peasants that were on the land. You had nobles who ruled over them. The Church of England and the king were defenders of the old feudal order. They were loyal to the old feudal system, whereas the capitalists in the city, they were critical of the feudal system. And there started to be a big divide in the rulers of Britain between the feudal aristocracy and the emerging capitalist class. And they were at odds with each other. And the king frequently sided with the feudal aristocracy, and the parliament that was elected officials tended to side with the capitalist class. And they started fighting with each other about all kinds of issues. One of them was that the king would levy taxes without the permission of the parliament. And you can imagine all the capitalists didn't particularly appreciate that. This king just declares, you got to pay some taxes, and they don't get any say on it. There's no vote. There's nothing. Another thing was that the king declared, since he's the king of the country, that he could take land from anybody. So these wealthy capitalists would own some big tract of land, and then the king would step in and say, nope, mine, and he would take it. And there was no due process through which they could oppose it. And there was this power struggle between the king and the parliament that was taking place. And the Church of England was the institution that propped up the rule of the king. And increasingly, the King of England, because he was critical of the emerging capitalist system, he increasingly started to become more friendly with Roman Catholic countries, because the Roman Catholic countries were countries where feudalism hadn't been dismantled. And he started befriending Catholic countries. And then to top it all off, he actually married a Roman Catholic, King Charles I. And so you have this situation where you have the feudal system, remnants of the feudal system, the king, the landowners, the nobles in the countryside, the Church of England. But then in the cities, you have this emerging capitalist economy. And the capitalist class of Britain that was emerging was increasingly wanting to push back against the power of the king. And the power of the king was largely backed up with the Church of England. So what did the emerging capitalist class do? They fomented religious movements to oppose the Church of England. And the first of these religious movements was called the Puritans, right? And that's a big part of American history, but we'll get to that later. But why were they called the Puritans? Because they wanted to purify the Church of England. They felt that the Church of England was not following the Bible. They felt that the Church of England was engaging in all kinds of, semi-Catholic rituals. And so you had this movement called the Puritans that emerged, and they stayed in the Church of England, but they wanted to force the Church of England to reform itself and purify itself. But then, after a while, it became clear the Church of England was not going to change. So you had a number of different groups that formed that were called separatists or dissenters. And these were people who quit the Church of England and started their own church in defiance of the law, which you have to remember, back then it was the law. You had to be a member of the Church of England. Well, these people defied the law. They said, we're not going to be part of the Church of England. And there were various groups that were formed, and they were all being supported by the capitalist class. The urban capitalists wanted to push back against feudalism. So they were giving money and allowing various movements of religious dissenters to emerge to push back against the Church of England. And this is really important because this is how revolutions tend to start. There's a fight among the rich and powerful, right? The rich and powerful are fighting. In this case, it's the feudal rich versus the capitalist rich, and they're fighting with each other. And they realize that in order to win, they've got to get the people on their side. And so a division in the ruling class creates an opening for the people. And because the capitalists of Britain didn't want the Anglican Church to rule over them, they started fomenting religious dissenters. In addition to that, they started fomenting democratic activism and populist activism and all kinds of activism among the working class of the cities. What's interesting was the printing press was a very new invention back then, right? It was a very, very new invention. But people were shocked about how in London, thousands and thousands of pamphlets were being distributed, putting forward different ideas about how society should change, because the capitalists needed to foment radical sentiment to push back against feudalism. And a lot of these movements emerged in London and in the urban cities that were made up of different types of radicals that wanted to mobilize the common people. Sometimes these movements were explicitly religious, and sometimes they were more political, but often they kind of overlapped. And there were a number of religious and political movements that emerged in the 1640s as the capitalists were kind of fomenting and opening up radical discussion, democratic empowerment as a way to push back against the monarchy. One of the movements that emerged was called the Levelers, and it was a group that wanted to greatly expand the right to vote. Now, they didn't want universal suffrage. They didn't want every member of every citizen, every man to be able to vote, but they wanted to greatly expand the right to vote. At the time, only those who owned property. You had to own a piece of land in order to vote. But they argued that it should be greatly expanded, like people in the military should be able to vote. They had a list of people that should be able to vote. And the Levelers, they were called, they published a manifesto. And they published this manifesto, the Levelers Manifesto. And members of the movement, they wore these hats, and they would put the manifesto in their hat as their symbol. It was fascinating. And they would march around, and the hat had this little manifesto, this little pamphlet in their hat, and that was their symbol. They were Levelers. There was a group called, we know what the Quakers are. George Fox was a religious leader at the time, and he argued that one could hear the voice of God within oneself. and that you had what he called the light within. And he was a pacifist, but he also believed that you had the light within. And he went around preaching what we now understand to be the religion of Quakerism, or the Society of Friends. You had a number of movements that were formed. There was a group called the Ranters, and they advocated sexual freedom. They were pantheists. They didn't believe in the Bible. They didn't believe in Christianity, but they believed in sexual freedom, and they were called the Ranters. And they went around promoting their religious belief, calling for sexual freedom, and they were widely hated by other people. They thought they were a bunch of crazy, degenerate, sexual, immoral people. And there were all these religious movements, political movements that were being fomented, and it was an upsurge of democratic participation. They had big debates in these big churches in London. Thousands and thousands of people would pile in to listen to debates that would go on for hours about whether or not the vote should be expanded, who should get to vote, how they should change the Constitution. There was a huge democratic upsurge in the urban centers of Britain. And ultimately what happened was that the Parliament and the king split apart. The king was saying that he should be able to continue levying taxes and seizing land. And the Parliament was saying, no, you can't. And the actual army of Britain was siding with the king. So the Parliament had to form its own army. And so they formed their own army. It was called the New Model Army. And it was a highly political army. Because most people that were just going to join the army would join the regular army. But the New Model Army, they called it, was a very political army. Now, the leader of the New Model Army was a member of Parliament named Oliver Cromwell. And Oliver Cromwell was, kind of a wealthy guy he'd spent most of his life being kind of depressed and suicidal, and he had really no purpose in life. But he had a religious awakening. He said that God spoke to him. He had a religious awakening, and he became a Puritan. And he was convinced that the Church of England was a Catholic conspiracy against Britain. And he was elected to Parliament, where he was a harsh critic of the king. And he was the guy who went out and built and organized this group called the New Model Army. And the New Model Army that was formed was led by Oliver Cromwell. And Oliver Cromwell, he was a religious fanatic. And he was a very effective military leader, but he led an army of many different factions. Every one of these different religious groups had its own wing of the army. The Levelers would march into battle with their hat with the manifesto in it. They would march into battle. And this should remind you of something, right? This should really remind you of something, because you'll remember that in China, somebody else centuries later formed a very political army. And every soldier had a little book with a statement of principles in it. And it was this mass mobilization, this mass upsurge of democratic participation that was happening in Britain as the rulers were fighting against each other. And Oliver Cromwell became the main leader of the forces that were opposed to the King of England. And ultimately, they won the war. And the King of England was charged with treason. The King of England was charged with treason, and he was found guilty for having said he had divine right. And they executed the King of England. And the King of England, Charles I, got his head cut off. And it was a really big moment in history. And there were some wild times that in the lead up to it. For example, apparently, the King of England, when he was captured, when he was on trial, he had a cane. He walked with a cane, and the cane had a knob on the top of it. And he dropped the knob in the courtroom. And he dropped it, and it fell on the ground. And then there was dead silence in the courtroom. And there was dead silence in the courtroom because for the first time in the king's life, no one was going to pick up the knob for him. And that was like the realization, this guy ain't the king anymore. He dropped the knob of his cane, it fell, and there was dead silence in the courtroom, and everyone looked on. No one's picking things up for this guy anymore. He's not the king anymore. And ultimately, the King of England received the death penalty. He got his head cut off for being a heretic for for advocating that he rule, saying he had divine right. They cut his head off, and Oliver Cromwell became basically the military dictator. Interesting fact is that Britain has no constitution at this time. They have the bylaws of their parliament, but they've never had a constitution. The only time they ever had a constitution was when Oliver Cromwell was running Britain. And the Constitution, he was written into the Constitution as the Lord and Protector. That was his title. He wasn't the king. He was the Lord and Protector of Britain. And Oliver Cromwell became the king, and he ruled. And a lot of amazing things happened during the English Civil War. For example, 1649, that's the year that the king got his head chopped off. One of these religious sects were socialists. Fascinating. There was a group called the True Levelers, or the Diggers, and they were socialists. And they were working class people who said exploitation was wrong, that capitalism and private property were wrong. And they seized an area called St. George's Hill, and they started, setting up a socialist society. And they seized control of it. That happened. And why did it happen? It happened because the capitalists were having to foment this mass movement. It was a wild situation, right? The army that was fomented, the new model army that was fomented to fight against the King of England, against the official British army, their nickname, they called the soldiers the Roundheads. That's what they were called. They were called Roundheads. And you know why that was? It's because they all had short hair. And they had short hair because only rich people could have long hair. Rich people back then had long hair. They had locks. They called it the locks of a gentleman. But the poor people, they couldn't afford to have fancy locks that they kept to look all fashionable. The poor people just got short hair like everybody else. So the slur for the new model army is they called them the Roundheads, or the Roundhead Army, because they were working class people. They were poor people who were mobilized to fight for their rights. And they believed in democracy. They believed in expanding the right to vote, and they believed in religious freedom. And many of them, it was on the one hand, this was a struggle between the emerging capitalist class and the remnants of feudalism. On the other hand, it was a political struggle. They were motivated by a belief in democracy, expanding, suffrage and the right to vote, democratic participation. But there was a spiritual aspect to it as well, because the Church of England had a very routine proceeding, right? Its rituals were all very regimented. They lit the candle here, they said this incantation and all of that. But the various dissenters that emerged, these were people who believed, usually all of them to some degree or other, believed you could have a direct relationship with God. You could feel the light of God within you. You could have religious experiences on your own. And, I guess George Fox, the founder of the Quakers, he apparently claimed he could do miracles. He could heal people. And George Fox, this founder of the Quakers, went around healing people. And that there were so many of these dissenters. There were many, many of these religious sects. There was one called the Muggletonians. They were Anabaptists. There were a number of these religious sects that were formed. And most of them believed that one could have some kind of spiritual direct connection with God, that the Church of England was cutting off people from having a direct spiritual religious experience. And that they were kind of unleashing a spiritual power and a fanaticism that was in the population, that they felt that the routine and authoritarian structure of the Church of England was holding back. It's very beautiful, and if you read what these people wrote, right, that these people, these various religious dissenters, these sects, these fanatical Protestant sects that made up the new model army that brought Oliver Cromwell to power, they were people that were just exploding with passion, right? They could feel God's presence in their soul. They were angry that any king would claim that God had put him on the throne. They were angry that anyone would tell them that they had to talk to God through the Church of England. They wanted to feel that passion themselves. They wanted to pray directly. They wanted to wrangle with moral and spiritual questions. They wanted widespread debate in society about what was right and wrong. This was an upsurge of democracy. You're on the list. It was an upsurge of democratic participation. It was an upsurge of spirituality. It was a mass religious revivalism that spread through Britain and laid the basis for ultimately the King of England to get his head cut off and for the capitalist class to triumph over feudalism. And if you look at that moment, what happened? Well, of course, after a few years, Oliver Cromwell was in power and he started cracking down on it. It had gone too far. And this happens in every revolution. It's called the Thermidor, right? And the French Revolution, it was the month in the French Revolutionary calendar when the Reign of Terror came to an end, right? And this happens in every revolution. The door opens and there's mass upsurge of democratic participation. The people are in motion. But then the new order comes into power, and the new order starts to dampen things down. And that happens in every revolution. And the diggers who seized St. George's Hill, they were executed, and they were killed. And there was a brutal repression of the diggers. There was brutal repression of the ranters for sexual immorality. Some of them got the death penalty for having, different sex partners and things like that. And that after a few years, this huge democratic, spiritual, religious, revolutionary upsurge among the British working class, it started to tone down. And that was the English Civil War. And you ask, why is this important? Well, I'll tell you, it's important for one particular reason, but several others as well. The first reason that it's very important to what we're doing now is because of the fact that, do you know what happened after the revolutionary upsurge and after the Puritans and the Quakers and the ranters and the diggers, and after the English bourgeoisie started tampering down on this revolutionary movement it had fomented for its own reasons? Where did they go? Where did they go? What happened? What did they do? They came here. Yeah, they came here. Who do you think settled Massachusetts? Those were the Puritans. Pennsylvania. What is Pennsylvania named after? It's named after William Penn, who was the successor of George Fox, the leader of the Quakers. All of these religious fanatics, these people who had been caught up in the revolutionary upsurge of religious fervor, democratic participation, in some cases even socialism, in the case of the diggers and the true levelers, these folks, as they saw the revolutionary energy was dying in Britain, and as the capitalists that they had fought for were now suppressing them, they got on a boat and they came to America. The Puritans founded Massachusetts. That's who the Pilgrims were. They were Puritans. And who, the Quakers, who were they? They were followers of George Fox. And the founding of America, these very people who got involved in the huge uprising to topple King Charles I, it was their kids and grandkids who were keeping that revolutionary tradition alive that started the United States of America. The United States of America was largely founded by people who kept the flame of the English Civil War going. It was revolutionaries, fanatical religious people, and revolutionary Protestants, full of religious passion, full of democratic ideals, full of a desire to build God's kingdom on earth, full of a desire to connect to God directly and have direct religious and spiritual experiences. That's who founded America. Now, we can talk about the awful things they did to the Native Americans, and we're very opposed to that, obviously. These people weren't perfect. But it was that upsurge of democracy, and it was that upsurge of spirituality that laid the basis of the founding of the American Republic. Think about that. However, It's important for yet another reason. It's important because we're now, hundreds of years later, we're in an oddly similar situation. Right now, obviously, feudalism is gone. But right now, there's a division in the ruling class, just like there was a division in the English ruling class. And the divide is somewhat similar. Under feudalism, the feudal landowners wanted to keep things as they were. They said, we can only have, you peasants, you work the land, I own the land, and we're satisfied with it. Whereas the capitalists were the ones that said, no, we want to build, we want to construct, we want to make more profits, we want new technology, we want to advance. That was the divide. You had the stagnant feudal aristocracy that was stuck in the past and stuck in tradition and just wanted to stagnate and keep everything as it was. And you had the emerging capitalist class that believed in progress and growth, etc. That same divide is happening in our ruling class right now. Joe Biden and the tech monopolies and the World Economic Forum more or less have the attitude of the feudal aristocracy. They want to drive down living standards. They want to stop historical progress, and they want to go backward. They say smaller is better, less is more. And they're trying to do that in order to preserve the existing system. They are opposed to social progress. In order to save capitalism, they want degrowth, and they want to make a highly regimented society in order to stifle human growth and to hold back historical progress. That's what the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab and all of them want. Whereas the lower levels of capital want to make money, and they believe growth is good, and they believe in the American dream of working hard and growing wealthy and constructing and advancing new technology. And it seems like, once again, we have a situation where we have the Church of England and the old ruling order battling against people who believe in growth and construction. There's a similar divide in our ruling class. And if you look at it, it's also, what was the Church of England? What was the King of England? It was this old, dying institution. People just going through the motions. People who didn't really believe in anything anymore. Corrupt, decaying institutions. People like Nancy Pelosi. People like Sleepy Joe Biden. People like Dianne Feinstein. This decaying, corrupt, bureaucratic institution that is saying, no, no, no. No more growth. Growth is bad. That was on the one side. And then on the other side, you had people that were imbued with spiritual power, that believed in growth and optimism, that wanted to construct, that were talking about, in some cases, talking about socialism, that were talking about having religious experiences, that were full of passion. That was the divide. It's almost like we're having the English Civil War all over again. And, mind you, where is the power behind Joe Biden, the power behind the neo-feudal degrowth faction? Where is it headquartered? London. The World Economic Forum, the Club of Rome, all of this is London. This is the British Empire. This is the English aristocracy. This is the Eastern establishment. This is the New England old money wealth trying to hold back historical progress, facing off against another section of the ruling elite that want to make money. But then that raises the question, what's going to happen next? What's going to happen next? Because we know that when the capitalists fight with each other, the next stage is they start recruiting workers into mass movements. to be their foot soldiers. And just like in 1649, that when they opened the door to create a mass movement, it led to some very exciting developments. The new model army, the diggers seizing St. George's Hill. It led to a huge opening through which the desire of the people for justice and truth and participation and wrangling and debate, they opened the door. And out of that door walked all kinds of things that were a threat even to the original capitalists. And mind you, the English Civil War, what was a major factor in making it happen? This new technology called the printing press. There's this thing called the printing press, and all of a sudden people could spread their ideas in a way that they couldn't before. People were printing pamphlets. Pamphlets were revolutionary. And all over London, people were handing each other pamphlets to read about democracy, to read about religion, to read about different concepts. The means of information had expanded. And with the means of information in their hands, the emerging capitalist class was able to mobilize forces on their side. Well, what are we living in right now? A huge expansion in the means of information. Computer technology, the internet. The fact that I'm broadcasting to you right now, ranting about the English Civil War, I'm not a ranter, it's because of a huge breakthrough in technology. So we're living in a period that very much mirrors the English Civil War. And that there's a division in the ruling class. There's a new mechanism for disseminating information that's available. And among the people, there is starting to be unrest and anger and a desire to assert themselves amid all of this unrest. And the point of division among the elite is the same point of division. Do we hold on to what's there and we just hold things back and everyone just has their place and it stays there? Or do we believe in growth and hope and optimism? Do we advance spiritually? Do we arise and talk about democratic empowerment? We're living in the English Civil War. This is the English Civil War 2.0. But who's Oliver Cromwell? Who's George Fox? Who are the diggers? Who are the ranters? Where are the Roundheads? Where's the new model army? We're living in the English Civil War, folks. We are living in the English Civil War. In a weird way, we are living in an updated, high-tech version of the English Civil War. And I want to tell you why this is so important. When we talk about Christianity, and we talk about Christianity and socialism, overwhelmingly, the way this topic is discussed is in a Catholic way. That's because of Latin America. It's because of the Cuban Revolution, because of Bolivarianism. And generally, Protestantism is associated with free market capitalism. Generally, right? Many people point out that the Protestant Reformation very much became an expression of the emerging capitalist class. And because of that, the Catholic Church made vaguely anti-capitalist statements against the Protestant Reformation, right? The Catholic Church condemned money. It said that money was sterile. The Catholic Church, the Catholic Church, because of it is a remnant of feudalism. It had a vague conservative anti-capitalism about it, and that is the way that Christian socialism has generally expressed itself in recent times, right? Christian socialism in the 20th century has largely been in the form of Catholic, utilizing the Catholic teaching that is a critique of money, that is a critique of capitalism from a feudal perspective, utilizing that to form some kind of solidarity with socialism. And I'm not Catholic, and I'm not from Latin America. And in Latin America, Father Romero, Daniel Ortega, these folks have done great things with that. I'm not knocking that, but that's not America. That's not America, right? I mean, we have plenty of Catholic people in America, but that's not the American spirit. Right? The American spirit is a very different thing. But if you look at the Diggers and you look at the early American socialist communes, you'll see a very different brand of Christian socialism. You'll see a Christian socialism that is very optimistic, that believes in growth, that doesn't identify with feudalism, but rather identifies with the revolutionary movements to destroy feudalism. You'll find a Christian socialism that has that passion and that spirituality in it that you saw in the English Civil War. And that is a brand of Christian socialism that is just waiting to flourish in the United States. Liberation theology has its place. And if you're Roman Catholic, I encourage you to explore liberation theology, right? Nothing wrong with that. But for Protestant Americans, for people who believe one can have direct spiritual experiences, that one can communicate with God on one's own, who can have a personal relationship with Jesus, for those who believe in economic growth, those who believe in a better tomorrow and optimism, liberation theology just doesn't hit, doesn't strike a chord, because it is a very Catholic phenomenon. Liberation theology is very much a Catholic thing. But there is another form of Christian socialism that you can find. Talk about Robert Owen, who started the city of New Harmony. City of New Harmony in Indiana. It was a socialist city that he established. Robert Owen, the first guy to use the word socialism in the English language. There's many Christian socialists in the early years of the English Civil War and in the early years of this country. You can read about, various Christian socialist communities that were established in the United States. And that, if there's going to be, and I've talked on here endlessly about the Second Great Awakening. So we know at the time that the American Revolution happened, right? In the lead up to the American Revolution, there was a mass religious revival movement called the Great Awakening. Jonathan Edwards was a big figure in it. But then in the lead up to the American Civil War, you had the Second Great Awakening. And the Second Great Awakening happened with Charles G. Finney, who's my ancestor, and a number of religious leaders going around and condemning the practice of slavery and urging people to repent, and arguing that America was moving in a sinful direction and that the ship had to be turned around. We had to move away from slavery, and that the emerging industrial capitalist class of the United States fomented the Second Great Awakening of fanatical Protestantism, tent revival meetings, etc., as a way to set the stage for the eventual fight to defeat slavery. And that John Brown, the great heroic slave revolutionary in the United States who led the raid on Harper's Ferry, John Brown was a product of the Second Great Awakening, right? He was motivated by his religious faith to seize Harper's Ferry, take hostages, etc. And that the Second Great Awakening, if you look at it, the Second Great Awakening was just a continuation of the English Civil War. And the point of division in the Second Great Awakening was the same as it is now. The slave system, the slave owners didn't want industrialization. They wanted to maintain an agrarian economy. They wanted to become the supplier. They wanted America to just be a bunch of slave plantations to supply the British with the cotton that they needed and the tobacco that they needed. They didn't want America to become industrialized. Whereas Abraham Lincoln and Henry Charles Carey and Henry Clay and people like that, they did want industrialization of the United States. And they rejected the financial system that was emerging from Britain. And so there was a clash between the slave system of the South, which was anti-growth, like the Queen of England, and the industrial capitalist class of the North. And that the Second Great Awakening was a very big part of that. And that there were a lot of socialists in the Second Great Awakening as well. The Second Great Awakening had a very socialistic edge to it. And that all of this is like the story of America. There's a fight in the world between the aristocratic mind that wants to stop progress, that is oligarchical, that views human beings as an annoying herd to be managed, that wants to end historical progress, that says human beings are like animals, they can be bred and they can be socially engineered. And the democratic, optimistic, historical progress mindset that says we can march to a new future by empowering people to be smarter than they were before, by advancing new technology, by increasing the population, by raising living standards. That is the divide. And that's when I talk about city builders and vandals. That's the divide. And that the entrenched aristocratic elite will foment vandals. They'll try to march history backward in order to stay in power. Whereas the forces of historical progress will mobilize and advance, and in some cases, they'll cut off the head of the King of England. And this division, this kind of defines American history. This defines the history of the world. And right now, we're seeing that around the world, this imperialist system, this British Empire, colonial, oligarchical system is under attack. It's under attack and it's being defeated. China has broken out of it. African countries are breaking out of it. Iran has broken out of it. Russia has broken out of it. Latin American countries, Nicaragua, Venezuela have broken out of it. That old system that is opposing growth and just wants to keep the world poor so they can stay rich. The mindset of the English aristocracy is dying. And within the American spirit, everywhere, our heritage as a bunch of roundheads, as a bunch of ranters, as a bunch of Quakers, as a bunch of Puritans, our heritage of building and optimism and construction and spirituality, that heritage that we have as Americans is everywhere. It's everywhere in this country, but we've been ruled over. We have a technological elite, a technocracy that rules over us that is trying to crush that spirit. And the American optimism is boiling and it wants to assert itself. And the oligarchy is trying, especially here in the homeland, in the center of their empire, to just tamper down and beat down the American spirit. This is the period that we're living in. There's a division in the ruling class. There's a global movement against their system, led largely, almost entirely by communists. Not every government involved is communist. The Iranian government rejects Marxism entirely. The Islamic Republic of Iran. Russia, though the Communist Party is a big party, they no longer are the Soviet Union. They reject Marxism. But if you look at the bulk of the countries that have broken out of Western domination, they did so with communism, Marxism, Leninism, or some form of socialism. Whether in Syria, you have Ba'athist Arab socialism. A number of African countries, they have their own interpretation of socialism. In Tanzania, Julius Nyerere had his African socialism. Gaddafi had his Islamic socialism. They have Bolivarian socialism in Latin America. But it is largely communism and socialism that has become the expression of humanity's desire for growth. Whereas the Western capitalist system that is now collapsing justifies itself in language of human rights, in language of opposing climate change, in language of social justice, and it's very interesting. This is the period that we're living in. This is the period that we're living in. And if you look at the English Civil War and you study the Diggers and what happened with the Diggers, you'll understand the period that we're living in. So I hope that my opening remarks tonight have made some sense to all of you. I hope I've spoken to you about why religion is becoming an increasingly important part of what we talk about on here, about why I study history and how to study history. Because, if you study history this way, right? If you study history this way, you can learn from history. What's the point of studying history? Is it just an interesting thing to learn from? Is it just fascinating? Is it memorizing dates like you did in high school, memorizing dates and names? No. You learn from history so that you can make history. You learn from history so you can make history. And we're living in a similar period, and we need to foment that democratic upsurge. That upsurge of democracy and spiritual power to defeat the aristocratic, oligarchical forces that want to hold back human progress. And there's a division in the ruling class. So that's what I wanted to communicate to all of you tonight. That's what I wanted you all to know. I hope that was helpful.